Thank you for joining me, and welcome to Paranormal Mysteries. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. On today's episode, we'll be talking about an extremely haunted house, a powerful grandmother, witches, and a terrifying experience in Louisiana's Lafayette Cemetery. But before we start, I'd like to thank everyone for their support and generosity. And for anyone who's interested in supporting the show, you can do so by sharing and reviewing the podcast, as well as visiting us at patreon.com/paranormalmysteries, or at buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. All of these methods help make the show possible, and we truly appreciate your support. And if you have a paranormal story to tell, you can contact me by email at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com, through voice message at speakpipe.com/paranormalmysteries, or on our website at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com. And remember that all of our links can be found within the show notes. And now, let's start the show with our first listener story of the night, which comes to us from B. And B's story is called My Grandmother, the Witch. B says, "Hi Nick. I recently submitted some of my stories to you, but since then I have experienced a few things that made me want to share the story about my grandmother. I never had a chance to get to know my grandmother, as she died when I was 7 years old, but I have always felt her around me growing up. Almost every person in my family has told me about how powerful my grandmother was, so I thought I'd share a few of their stories. This took place in the late 70s or early 80s when my parents were still dating. My grandparents had gone on a holiday, so my parents decided to host a dinner party at my grandparents' house without their knowledge. As devout Catholics, my grandparents ran a very traditional and strict house, so an unsupervised party was a big no-no. During the party, the phone rang, and knowing it was my grandfather, my mother turned the music down and told everyone to be quiet as she answered. But instead of my grandfather being on the other end as expected, it was my grandmother, so my mom knew already that she was in trouble. When asked how things were going, my mother naturally lied, saying that her and my dad were home alone, enjoying a quiet evening. My grandmother then told my mother that she knew she was lying and was having a party, but as any teenager would, my mother added to the lie, making the situation worse. As the story goes, my grandmother told my mother to stop lying, as she knew they were having a party, with my mother then replying, "How did you know?" And just then the curtain rail in the living room fell off the wall, crashing to the floor, causing everyone in the house to scream with fright, blowing my mother's lies right out of the water. Even though they were devout Christians, we all believe that my grandmother was an undercover witch. This story goes back to when my grandparents were seeing one another before they got married. My grandmother was very close to her father, so when he passed, she was very upset. Shortly after he passed, my grandfather went to visit my grandmother to console her. At the time, my grandmother was studying to be a nurse and was staying at the residence near the hospital. As the story goes, my grandfather was sitting on a chair while my grandmother was sitting on her bed. They were talking about her dad and recalling stories when a gust of wind blew through the curtains and then settled down. Just then, my grandfather noticed a depression in the bed sheets forming next to my grandmother as if someone had just sat down. Noticeably shocked at what she was witnessing, my grandmother looked next to her and began crying, and just as quickly as it happened, the sheets went back to normal. After calming down, my grandmother said she knew that it was her father, and he had come to say goodbye. I have always been sensitive to the paranormal, so hearing these stories about my grandmother made me wonder if she had maybe passed her gift down to me. While I can see, sense, hear, and talk to those that have passed, my strongest ability are my sense of smell and my nightly vivid dreams. For as long as I can remember, I have always had vivid dreams, and as I got older, I learned to understand what was being communicated to me and how to control my dreams. And this brings me to the last story for now. As a young boy, I used to dream of my grandmother often, and they were mostly messages for my grandfather during his grieving process. The older I got, the less frequent they became, until the passing of my grandfather, when I dreamt that they were together, and that was over 10 years ago. My grandfather now visits me in my dreams. The most recent was of him chatting with my uncle that passed away last year. This was a message for my cousins that are still grieving. Recently, my sister announced that she and her partner have started the process to fall pregnant. As they are not following the traditional method, they have limited chances, and each try has a big price tag, so it's easy to understand that they were anxious after the first attempt. As time passed, my sister felt that the egg had not taken, but we all told her that it was just her nerves. That night, I dreamt of my grandmother, who was sitting with my mother in the lounge of my childhood home. As I walked in and saw her, I dropped what I was carrying and ran over to her to give her a hug, as I understood that she was there to visit me. As I hugged her, I smelled her unique scent, reaffirming that she was there. When I asked her how she was, she replied with, "I'm not feeling well. I need to go." And like that, she left, and I woke up feeling very emotional, like I was grieving. I immediately called my mom to tell her about the dream, worried it was a message about my father's health. But after speaking with her, she told me to contact my sister. I told her about my dream, and I reassured her that our loved ones are around. But 2 days later, my sister messaged me saying that the egg didn't take. My grandmother had sent my sister a message, reaffirming what she already was feeling. And since that dream, I have felt her around me more and more, so I'm hopeful that my sister is blessed with the child she is so desperate for. I want to say thank you for giving us a platform to talk about our experiences. While my family is very open to the paranormal as well, telling my stories to you, whether they are used or not, is very therapeutic. Stay safe. Regards, B. Our next story of the night comes to us from Regina, and Regina's story is called A Witch's Story. Regina says, "Hi Nick, I am very pleased to finally being able to write my experience. I live in Mexico, and here stories about witches and dark magic are very common, and I can guarantee that any person here will tell you a story told to them by their grandmothers, if you ask. Anyway, today I'm here to write about my mother's experience when I was a newborn. As I am a second child, my parents wanted a bigger home for all of us and started looking for one when they knew that my mom was pregnant. And as none of the options suited their taste, they ended up doing all the paperwork just a few days before my birth, which led up to us having to stay on one of my father's family's properties in a small town in Puebla for a few weeks. Now, these legends are most popular in small towns where people are wholeheartedly Catholic. I was raised in a Catholic home, but my parents never took it that far. Just a week after arriving to that house, my dad had to return to the city in order to get the paperwork done, leaving my mom and 2-year-old big brother alone there, with me as a baby, of course. Please bear in mind, the town had less than a 700 population, and houses are very distant from each other, meaning that seeing neighbors around was very uncommon. The second night after my father had left, my mom started listening to weird flaps around the house every night, followed by frightening screams as if someone was being murdered outside. After a week of these, my mom called my grandma to ask if she could call the police or something, to which my grandmother responded, "It was a witch, wanting to take me and eat me, since I hadn't been baptized." My grandmother suggested for my brother and mom to pray every night before going to sleep, placing a pair of open scissors under our pillows as a kind of protection spell, not as a weapon. And finally, if my mother ever saw a red-eyed bird or rat outside the window or closer, she should yell every insult she could think of at it, and to not even think about going to sleep at that moment, without having prayed for at least an hour after the animal had gone. My grandmother also explained that witches turned into animals at night to take children away, and offer them to the evil. And the most effective way of getting rid of them was to insult them with all of your might, and baptizing the baby as soon as possible. My mom followed the instructions carefully that night, and for the next couple of days, everything stopped. But one night, as I was sleeping by my mother's bed, she heard a huge bang, followed by me crying horribly late at night. Immediately, she turned the lights on, only to find me by the end of the room, almost by the window, which was completely opened, with a horrible, huge red-eyed bird on it. My mother yelled at it while hurrying to pick me up, while the bird, as my mother explains, started to curse me back with the most terrifying deep voice I've ever heard. Finally, when it started backing up, my mom ran to my brother's room and prayed there till morning, while the bird kept screaming outside. After that, my mother says that she found deep scratches all over me, and she decided to have me baptized that very morning. I don't really know if these have anything to do with me finding myself in really weird experiences during my whole life, but that is a story for another time. I hope this story finds a way into your podcast, and thank you for creating a safe place for our experiences. Regards, Regina. Our next story of the night comes to us from Tetra, and Tetra says, I was trucking down in the States with my ex. We had traveled coast to coast and had had many weird experiences, and this happened to be one of the more paranormal, instead of just freaky, experiences. This happened in New Orleans at the beginning of August, 2005. We had finally made it to New Orleans, the home of voodoo and Mardi Gras. Ever since my brother told me about the graveyards, the voodoo shops, and the other strange things, I wanted to see them. Call it a morbid curiosity or just simply fascination with the macabre. Either way, I wanted to go. I heard that the mausoleums and headstones were beautiful, and the local lore had me interested. I had just gotten a new 35mm camera, and I had taken a few photography classes in high school, so I wanted to capture the area in the best way I knew how. I know 35mm was old school even back in 2005, but something about not knowing if a shot came out and not having instant gratification made me feel like I was some sort of a real artist. We had dropped the trailer at the Home Depot we were unloading at and drove down to the Lafayette cemetery. We zigzagged through the streets in complete awe of the old plantation-type homes. There was this one ginormous home that looked like it could have held at least a half a football team. The place was utterly beautiful, but there was something very uneasy about it. I'm sure that a lot of horrible things had happened there, so we didn't stop, and we drove right on by. My ex did not, and I do mean did not, like anything unknown, spiritual or mildly occult-like, so he flat out refused to go with me, stating that it was boring, but I could see that he was actually scared. Pulling into the nearly empty street, I had half expected there to be tons of people, because from what I had gathered this was a tourist attraction. Since it was a residential area, we couldn't park the bobtail truck, so he tossed me the cell phone that had like 15 minutes of prepaid call time left, and said to call him when I was done. He basically dropped me off at the gate and sped away like a complete chicken. The mausoleums looked like finely built houses, sitting there on stone pads, some of them growing moss, and others had fresh flowers on their stoops. I was walking the stone paths that weaved through the hollow ground. There was a complete ominous feeling like I was being watched, and it filled me with dread. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my body, causing my very existence to run cold. It was borderline 90 degrees outside, but it still caused me to shiver. I continued along the path, clicking away on my camera, taking pictures of the weeping cherub angels and the praying figures that marked the headstones. I must have lost track of time, and the sun was starting to dip down over a particularly unnerving tree. I had forgotten we were in the South, and the possibility of a snake or something just as freaky could fall from that tree, and as this dawned on me, I began to make my way back to the gate. The towering gate looked even more sinister in the dimming light. I quickened my pace, and I spotted a lady of African descent. She was probably nearing 80 years old and very frail-looking with a bright-colored outfit, and her gray hair peeked out of a bandana-type headdress. She had a necklace of what appeared to be wood or possibly bone draped around her neck. I must have startled her, because she snapped her head toward my direction in such a swift movement that I was surprised she hadn't broke her neck. She was looking me straight in my face. She had one milky eye, and the other darted back and forth like it was searching for something to focus on. She had appeared so quickly I was visibly shook, and she possibly sensed my fear. I rationalized with myself that it was totally possible that she was leaning down to put flowers on the nearby grave, but as I got closer to where she was, I didn't see any flowers. She motioned for me to come over, and despite my gut feeling, I walked cautiously over to where she stood. I assumed that she just needed help getting up, or help to her car or something. I suppose I was trying to be the good citizen, and get my good karma points for the day. I thought I was far enough away that if for some reason I needed to bolt, I could, but I was apparently within arm's length of her. Swifter than a freaking lion, she grabbed my arm so tight that she left bruises on my forearm. With her nails digging into my skin, I let out a small squeak of terror. She pulled me towards her leathery face and her milky eye. Her good eye was black as pitch, and the whites had yellowed over time, and small serpents of red slithered across her face. She smelled like rotting leaves and blood. She smelled like death. She spoke to me in a very deep, I have smoked 3 packs a day for the last 40 years, raspy voice. She said, "Get out." "Excuse me? I thought this was a public cemetery. I'm just visiting. I mean no harm," I managed to whisper. Pulling me closer to her face, I could see her gnarly, snarled teeth. The few that were left were tobacco-stained and barely hanging on for dear life. Her hot breath was pungent, and I swallowed back a gag. She said, "Leave. Leave this place, or you will drown for your sins." Then off in the distance I hear, "Hello? Hey, are you there? You need me to pick you up?" I had a ninja death grip on my phone, which I had apparently dug out of my bag while the old lady had me in her clutches. I must have dialed it, but I don't remember entering a number, and we didn't have any number on speed dial, so the fact that my ex was on the other line was a blessing in disguise. Just as quickly as she had snatched me, she let me go, almost forcibly throwing me to the ground. She was strangely strong for someone who looked so frail. I had walked outside the gate, waiting on the curb for my ex to come around the corner. It was getting much darker, and the chirping of crickets started off in the distance. I could still see the lady pacing back and forth at the grave, watching me. Her mouth was still moving like she was talking to herself, or perhaps cursing me. The lights of the truck came into view, and I was finally safe. The hero of the story had shown up on his white horse to save me. Or in this case, the Yahoo in a purple bobtailed Peterbilt jerked to an abrupt stop as I nearly jumped into the street to get away from the cemetery. Flinging open the door in one foul swoop, I hopped into the front seat and slammed the door shut. Looking confused, my ex asked me why I looked so scared, and immediately began to poke fun at me, saying that I was scared and that I was afraid of the dark, and that he told me that I shouldn't visit the place of the dead. I told him what had happened with the old lady and exclaimed, "Hell yeah, I was scared. That old lady was freaky." He looked at me blankly and asked, "What lady?" and then motioned towards the gate. She had simply vanished. There were no other cars in the street, and it was empty besides the idling semi-truck. There was only one way in and one way out of the cemetery, and we were parked right in front of the gate. If anyone would have come through the gate, we would have seen it. I then stressed to my ex that we needed to leave the state, telling him that the old lady had warned me. He didn't believe me, but he still put in for a job heading out of the South. We had put in for a few different trips. One was a quickie to Georgia, and the other finished in Northern California, but it had us deadheading to Biloxi, Mississippi. Later that night, we got the confirmation that we had got the load to Northern California that night, and we were on the road out of Louisiana. 2 weeks later, Hurricane Katrina hit. Had I not listened to the old lady in the Lafayette cemetery, we could have very well been added to the casualties list. Our next story of the night comes to us from Lisa, and Lisa's story is called Terrorizing My Dog. Lisa says, "Hey guys, I totally love your show. Once I found it, I binge-listened while driving to and from work. I am a country girl from Arkansas living in a small rural town. In 2008, I purchased a new old home in this small town for my family. Immediately upon moving in, we knew we were not going to be alone in this house. For some reference, I have always believed in the paranormal because my mother and aunt had some experiences that I remember hearing about since being a small child. The paranormal has always been presented to me as fact. When we moved in, my ex-husband was a non-believer and had never had an experience. He quickly had no choice but to acknowledge that this house was haunted, because when you move into a haunted house, it is haunted whether you believe it or not. While moving in, doors would slam shut down the hall with no one down there. We would walk in the kitchen and all the drawers and cabinets would be open. We watched a glass raise up off the kitchen counter and smash to the floor. We would see shadows and movement down the hall and across doorways. My daughter was the first to see someone, and her room always felt the heaviest in the whole house. She had a large walk-in closet with a sink and cabinets in it, and it was frequently cold in that closet. My daughter saw the apparition of a young man standing in her closet. She was able to describe him as tall and thin with long stringy hair. He was wearing jeans, no shirt, and no shoes. She saw a rag hanging out of his pocket. She was paralyzed with fear and stood there staring at him until he disappeared. Now, I was not from this town and did not know many of the people here, and years later I described this young man to a friend at work who happened to be married to a man that had grown up in this community. She told her husband about the experience, and he immediately knew who my daughter had seen. The man had lived down the street and died young. This freaked us all out, but we were stuck. We did not have the funds to just leave. Now, years later, my daughter has grown up and moved on, having a daughter of her own. My granddaughter was at the house, sitting with me on one end of the couch. She was about 3 at the time. She pointed down to the other end of the sectional and said, "Grandma, who's that?" Of course, we were home alone, and no one was down there. I then took her outside to play. She did not seem scared, so that did put me at ease. Later during that same visit, I was cooking and we were sitting on the kitchen floor playing. This time she looked over toward the dining room table and jumped into my lap and pointed and whispered, "Grandma, who's that?" This time she was obviously scared, but I couldn't see anything. I turned off all the burners on the stove and we went outside for a while. This one did make me angry because I wanted to see what she could see and punch it in the face for scaring my precious grandbaby. I did the usual things, such as blessing the house, telling it to leave, burning sage, and salting windows. This did seem to help, but things have never stopped happening. Over the years, lots of updating has been done to our house, and each time we remodel a room, unusual and strange things ramp up again. I want to tell you about the one that has freaked me out the most. I'm a grown-ass woman of 45, and this right here gets me every time I think about it. For Christmas a couple of years ago, my husband gave me my best friend. His name is Ollie, and he's a beautiful little Maltese. This dog loves me and is always right by my side. We were remodeling the bathroom, and he had become quite jumpy. I could make a small move and he would jump and look around. It was like he was scared. I accused my husband of being mean to him when I wasn't around, but he basically told me that I was crazy, and so was my dog. Typical man. Anyway, I had let Ollie out to potty and was waiting at the back door to let him back in. My back door is a solid clear glass door. That night, with the light on in the mudroom and the way I was holding the door open, it was basically like a mirror. I could see myself and everything around and behind me. So, Ollie came running up, just bouncing and happy to get to me. He looked up at me, and his eyes widened in fear. He put the brakes on and slid across the carport to a stop. He was barking and growling, and obviously scared to death. He then turned and ran. Now remember, I am standing in the doorway with my right hand on the door handle, holding the door open, waiting for my baby to run back in. I was shocked by what my dog was doing. I then looked up into the glass door and saw my reflection. I also saw what was scaring Ollie. Directly over my left shoulder was the face of a man wearing an old-style fedora hat. It was as if he was resting his head on my left shoulder, and his face was pretty much right beside mine. He was older with a long, thin face. His eyes were small and dark, his nose long and thin, but his smile is what got me. It was wide and menacing. He was looking at Ollie and smiling his evil grin. This thing was doing this with intent. He was intentionally messing with my dog. Now, don't think I took this in stride. I freaked out and ran out the door and into the yard while looking back to see who that was. It was as clear as me in that glass, but when I looked back, no one was there. My dog wouldn't even come to me. My husband had to go outside and get Ollie and bring him back in the house for me. And let's be honest, he had to come to get me too. I was terrified. This was a malicious, intelligent monster terrorizing my dog. Who or what would do that? Like I said, not believing doesn't make these occurrences any less true. Thank you for giving us all a space to share. May you have health and happiness always. Lisa. As we come to the end of tonight's episode, I appreciate all of you for tuning in, and a special thank you goes out to B, Regina, Tetra, and Lisa for sharing their experiences. And if you've had a paranormal experience and would like to share your story, you can contact me through email, voice message, or on our website, and these links can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I look forward to seeing you back here on Monday with our 200th episode. From everyone at Paranormal Mysteries, thank you for listening, and please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.